It was just a simple dare at a party with friends, but for the terrified Marcos, it quickly spiraled into a nightmare. As the night wears on, chilling secrets come to light, and he can't shake the feeling that something is terribly amiss, that this evening holds far more than just fun. As he delves into the shadows, he uncovers the shocking truth that some urban legends are chillingly real.
The campfire crackled softly, sending sparks spiraling into the star-studded sky. Marcos sat on a log, surrounded by friends, their laughter filling the night as they exchanged stories and roasted marshmallows. The forest around them loomed dark and silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. His friend Javier leaned forward, gesturing animatedly as he recounted an exaggerated tale about a haunted cabin deep in the woods. Everyone laughed, but Marcos found himself distracted. At first, it was faint, merely a whisper on the wind, a sound that could have easily been mistaken for the rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. But as minutes passed, it grew clearer. The unmistakable sound of a woman sobbing, heart-wrenching and filled with despair. Marcos turned his head, scanning the trees, his heart racing.
Did you guys hear that?
Marcos asked, cutting into Javier's story.
Hear what?
Javier replied, raising an eyebrow as he popped a marshmallow into his mouth.
That's crying.
Marcos said, his voice uneasy.
It sounds like a woman. It's coming from over there.
He pointed toward the dense thicket beyond the firelight. His friends exchanged puzzled looks, and Javier smirked.
Come on, man. Don't let the ghost stories get to you. There's no crying woman out here.
Marcos frowned, straining his ears. The sobbing was unmistakable now, piercing through the laughter and crackling fire. It was close, too close. Yet none of his friends seemed to notice. They returned to their banter, oblivious to the eerie sound that sent chills racing down Marcos's spine.
I'm serious.
He said, standing abruptly.
I can hear her. It's real, no doubt.
Sure you can.
Javier teased, tossing a twig into the fire.
The next thing you'll say is that it's La Llorona herself.
The group laughed, but Marcos wasn't listening. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate. He couldn't ignore it. Taking his flashlight from his backpack, he muttered,
I'm going to check it out. I'll be back.
Wait, are you serious?
Javier asked, his smile fading.
Marcos, it's probably just the wind. Don't go wandering off.
I won't go far.
He replied, already stepping away from the circle of light cast by the fire.
I need to see where it's coming from.
The laughter and chatter of his friends faded behind him as he ventured into the woods, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sobbing seemed to guide him, each step drawing him closer to its haunting source. The trees pressed around him, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The further he walked, the colder the air became, and an uneasy feeling settled deep in his chest.
Hello, anybody there?
He called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The sound felt absurd in the oppressive silence that followed. He strained his ears, listening, but the crying stopped. Only the gentle lapping of water against the rocks remained. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint, mournful wail. Marcos shivered, clutching his flashlight tightly as he navigated the overgrown path along the riverbank. He had heard the stories his abuela told him as a child, the legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman. It had always been a tale to scare children into behaving, but now, standing here under the cold glow of the moon, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth behind the myth. Marcos had come to this place on a dare. His friends had laughed at his unease, teasing him for believing in ghost stories. Spend just 1 hour by the river with us, they'd said, and prove there's nothing to fear. But as the cries grew louder, more sorrowful, he regretted every step that had brought him here. He paused by the water's edge, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The river moved sluggishly, its surface shimmering faintly in the moonlight. The sound of crying grew closer, a heart-wrenching sob that seemed to echo in his chest. It wasn't the wind or the rustling of leaves. It was a woman's voice, raw with despair.
Hello?
Marcos called out, his voice trembling. The sound felt absurd in the oppressive silence that followed. He strained his ears, listening, but the crying had stopped. Only the gentle lapping of water against the rocks remained. Just as he was about to turn back, a figure emerged from the shadows. She stood on the opposite bank, her white dress moving unnaturally in the breeze. Her long, dark hair obscured her face, but Marcos could see the way her shoulders shook as she cried.
Lady, are you okay?
He shouted, his voice breaking. No response. The woman's cries softened into whimpers, and then she began to hum, a haunting melody that sent chills racing down his spine. He stepped closer to the water, his flashlight trembling in his hand.
Do you need help?
He called again, louder this time. The woman stopped humming. Slowly, she lifted her head, revealing a face shrouded in shadow. Her eyes, however, gleamed with an unnatural light, cold, piercing, and unrelenting. Marcos froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman extended a hand toward him, her fingers long and claw-like, dripping with water. A sob escaped her lips, her voice breaking as she whispered,
Mis hijos, have you seen my children?
Marcos stumbled back, shaking his head. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground.
I haven't seen them.
He stammered, his voice barely audible. Her cries grew louder, more anguished. The river seemed to churn and bubble as if responding to her grief. Marcos turned to flee, but the ground beneath him felt slick and unstable. He slipped, falling hard onto the muddy bank. When he looked up, she was closer. Her dress no longer looked white but stained with dark streaks, as if soaked in blood and river muck, and for a brief second her face twisted into a mask of fury and despair.
Why won't you help me?
She looks older, really old. She screamed, her voice a shrill echo that pierced the night. The wind howled around them, drowning out his panicked cries. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the river itself had risen to engulf him. Marcos scrambled to his feet, his flashlight forgotten in the mud. He sprinted back toward the trail, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, the cries followed, shifting between sorrowful wails and blood-curdling screams. He tripped over a root and fell again, his hand scraping against the rough ground. The crying stopped. Silence pressed down on him, heavier than before. He dared to look back, his chest heaving. The river was still, the figure nowhere in sight. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. A cold hand clamped onto his shoulder, its grip like ice. He turned his head slowly, tears streaming down his face. There she was, inches away, her face now fully visible in the pale moonlight. Her hollow eyes were pools of darkness, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth.
Stay with me. Help me find them. Stay with me forever. Stay,
she whispered, her voice soft but laced with malice.
Stay with me. Help me find them. Stay with me forever.
Marcos screamed, tearing himself free from her grasp. He ran blindly, his lungs burning, until he burst into the clearing where his friends had dared him to go. They were waiting for him, their laughter dying as they saw his pale face and trembling form.
What happened?
One of them asked, stepping forward.
She's real.
Marcos gasped.
La Llorona. She's real.
His friends exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could respond, the sound of crying echoed through the trees. It was faint at first, but grew louder, closer, more agonizing. The group froze, their faces pale. The temperature plummeted, and the wind carried her voice once more.
Mis hijos, where are my children? Where are my children?
Panic set in, and they ran, their laughter replaced by screams as the cries followed them through the forest. Marcos didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel her presence, cold and relentless, like death itself. Even now, as Marcos tells his story, he still hears her in his dreams, her cries echoing through the night, a chilling reminder that some legends are far more than just stories. La Llorona is portrayed as a protector of waterways, guarding them against pollution and harm, and also as a vengeful, malevolent spirit. But he and his friends didn't stay long enough to find out. And if you ever find yourself near a river on a quiet, moonlit night, beware of the woman in white. By the time you hear her cry, it's already too late.
What would you do if you heard a woman's wails in the dead of night, echoing along a lonely riverbank? Would you go to help, or would you run? Please comment below. And don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our scary story coming up next.